Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz guitarist Ryan Meagher. He is promoting his latest and newest 2018 CD, Lost Days, and he is quite happy with the sound it produced. And he should be years from now. That's what he says. He talked to Neon Jazz about growing up in San Jose, California, getting a music degree at San Diego State University, moving on to New York, where he released his debut jazz album called Sun Resounding. And he has plenty of growth coming up and that he wants to talk about. These days, he is in Portland, Oregon, in a very healthy jazz scene. He's teaching, recording, and performing. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, Ryan, thanks for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and hop right into Lost Days here. Talk to me about this project, and now that it's reached fruition, how do you feel about it?
I'm really happy with it. It's sometimes an interesting ride being an artist, and sometimes we listen to recordings that we've done in years past and get kind of embarrassed by them, and just dealing with that is kind of part of the road of being an artist. And after listening to this record a bunch of times, which is kind of what you have to do when you're making a record, I got the sense that wasn't going to be so much of an issue in later years. I feel really happy about the music that came out on the record. I think I will cringe less on this record in the future than other records in the past.
Nice. What do you want the listener to get from this experience?
That's a great question. One of my intentions nowadays with my art is to connect with people. I tend to be inspired by people and by places, and a lot of the music on Lost Days it comes from that inspiration. Sometimes it's specific people, sometimes it's just like the idea of a connection with a person, and sometimes they're from specific memories or specific places. The title track, for one, Lost Days, has it came out of a really fun weekend with friends from my hometown, helping them move and stuff, and I kind of had like this sense of like not being lost necessarily, but like where does the time go, and like what do we do with it? And it just kind of started with just droning on my friend's acoustic guitar that he's had since we were in high school, and it's like the most difficult instrument I've ever played, but it actually sounds really great. And I was helping him move, and so I was in this hardwood floored room that was completely empty, just playing this like kind of droning sound, and we had way too many beers over the weekend, so it was just like I was just trying to kind of capture this feeling of like lifelong friends and moving on in life and that kind of thing. And so I try to like capture those kind of moments in my music.
Let me get a kind of an idea of where you grew up. You grew up in San Jose. Talk to me about your childhood, how the guitar was the instrument that spoke to you. Just kind of talk to me about also how you got into jazz.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm from San Jose, and my childhood was great, man. My parents are so great, and I had I was really loved by all my family and family friends and stuff. So I don't know why it is that I was so angsty as a teenager, but I was definitely just full of like rage and like listening to Rage Against the Machine all the time and stuff. So I don't know where that comes from because it doesn't make any sense, but that was kind of what got me interested in music, is like the energy and kind of angst behind some of the music that was around at the time. My first musical influence was Nirvana. I definitely gravitated to the grunge rock thing. And I think a lot of that, I'm not sure. I mean, my parents were married all the way through college for me, and then they got divorced. But I remember reading about the grunge era one time, and it was like the grunge era was basically when children of divorce picked up guitars. And to me, that like made a lot of sense. I mean, my parents were great to me, and they were kind to each other, but there was like just kind of this underlying, I think, disconnect or something with my generation and their parents or something, even though my parents are so great. I think that's kind of what fueled the angst. But what got me into jazz, my first instrument was actually trumpet, and I picked up the trumpet in 7th grade just because I didn't want to do home economics in middle school. So you could either pick like the home economics route, and there's also like wood shop and stuff, or you could be in band. I was like, well, band sounds kind of cool, I'll do that. And so I picked up the trumpet, and then the band director made me switch to trombone to be in jazz band. And I didn't like trombone, but I did it anyway. And then when that was over, I threw the trombone in the trash and stuck with the guitar that I had been messing around with, playing Nirvana tunes with my friends. And somehow I made it into jazz band as a freshman in high school. Like from there, I just like started to learn more about jazz, and then jazz hit me like a ton of bricks my sophomore year of high school, and I never looked back. So I stuck with jazz and guitar.
So before I get into like the early albums that you listened to in jazz, I got to say, I come from that grunge era, from the 90s, the Gen X thing. I think probably what happened was, I think that whole Douglas Copeland Gen X existential notion really kind of spread over us, and there probably was a part of all of us that saw our parents buying into that 50s, 60s notion, and we didn't want it. You know what I'm saying? The whole, you got to go to the suburbs, you got to have a nuclear family. If you don't do this, the world's not going to accept you. But that's not what Cobain and Vedder and Cornell and all those guys were singing about. What they were singing about was breaking free not only from the musical convention that was happening, because that was such a new way of putting a spin on music, but it was also about societal constructs that I think all of us were like, we're not going to do what you guys did. We're going to travel. We're going to live free. We're going to do things that just aren't a part of what society believes we need to do. That's what I kind of think coming from that era was happening.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. I'm kind of on the my age group. I'm on the tail end of Gen X and at the beginning end of the millennials. So I'm 36, and specifically there's a couple year window around my age where we don't even know where we fit in yet. I'm the oldest, but our older brothers and sisters, or our friends' older brothers and sisters, were definitely Gen X and kind of feeding that. And then we had younger brothers and sisters that were millennials, and but I definitely agree with what you're saying. I'm not sure I was totally at my age listening to grunge and stuff totally on board with I'm not going to do what society tells me yet. I think those seeds were being planted mostly by the music I was listening to.
Yeah, I think so. I think it took a little while, but I think the message, we basically went immediately from hair bands to grunge. That's a pretty big revolutionary step. So I think there was a lot that was going on. But sticking within the realm of jazz, what early jazz albums did you listen to that really got your mind moving towards that direction?
I have a very specific example. The first jazz album I ever owned was in middle school, and it was a compilation of Louis Armstrong stuff because of the trumpet thing. I remember kind of being into the trumpet, and I asked my band director, I was so who do I listen to? I don't even know what's going on. Louis Armstrong was the first one she recommended, and I had heard that name, so I think I asked my parents for a CD, and they bought me one. That was the first one. I listened to that a lot. In my sophomore year, I said jazz hit me like a ton of bricks. It was actually there's one specific moment that I was jazz is the thing I'm doing for the rest of my life. And it was the first time I heard Blue Train from Coltrane. And on the title track, during Lee Morgan's solo, and I think that's probably because of the connection to the trumpet, but there's in each one of the choruses on that tune, they kind of imply double time, or Philly Joe implies double time for two choruses. And coming out of that, in Lee Morgan's solo, he plays this super powerful bluesy lick, and it still gives me tingles in my spine just thinking about it. But when I heard him do the da 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 da, my world just instantly changed. So that's the Blue Train is the one for sure.
I like it. Yeah, I remember those moments. In fact, it's funny. I flew to Seattle in '95. And at that time, the grunge scene was going real serious. And I remember hearing Miles Davis's Kind of Blue on the flight from Kansas City up there. And I was like, wow. Everything just changed,
Yeah.
Never, ever heard anything like that. So, but so you go to San Diego State University and, you get your higher education. What kind of advice did you get from mentors that has stuck with you throughout all these years? Yeah,
actually, San Diego State had a big influence on me, and I'm still trying to figure out a way to make this sound not insulting to that school. I'm really thankful for the time I got there. I would say a lot of the jazz education that has stuck with me the most during that time didn't come from school. It came from one of my peers at the school. His name was Josh Welches. He's a trumpet player in the Los Angeles area now. And he was the hip guy, and I kind of followed him around like a puppy dog. And he plugged me into the scene in San Diego, Gilbert Castellanos and such. And from there, I had mentors like Joe Bagg in Los Angeles, and that's where I met the Ferbers, Alan and Mark Ferber, Anthony Wilson, and guys like that. So I learned a lot, like, outside of school. But, like, just kind of hanging around those guys, they kind of polished the edges or something, or on my outlook of what it was going to be like when I moved to New York, because I knew I was going to move to New York. So they kind of just, like, helped prepare me mentally for the move, so I didn't feel as much like, you know, like lost when I got there. At San Diego State, I think the biggest thing that they did for me is kind of help me decide how I wanted to approach jazz education. Because when I moved to New York and I was talking to people and hanging with people and playing with people, I realized that my college jazz education didn't deal with most of what's actually happening on the scene. So a few years later, when I was thinking about being a jazz educator, I was like comparing it to what my experience was and what experience I was getting as a professional on the scene.
When you get to New York, you release your debut album, and you really get kind of immersed in the scene. It's obviously a dream for a jazz musician to go to New York. Was it the dream you realized you thought it was going to be when you first started playing gigs there and you got to see shows there? Was that dream as big as you thought it was going to be?
Both yes and no. People still ask me, the students ask me about New York and like, should I move to New York? Or it's not even students, like maybe former students that are now friends or things like that. And my answer is always yes. I guess the shininess of moving to New York and stuff, I didn't move there as wide-eyed as I could have, I suppose. As soon as I got there, I just became part of the scene. I'm not trying to overstate my importance or anything like that, but I just went to shows. I would talk to people. I would hang out with people. I would do sessions. I would, I just felt like I was part of it, and so it never really swept me off my feet or anything like that. I just kind of jumped right in and tried to keep my head above the water. So kind of yes and no. I mean, it was amazing to play. Like I got to play with Jim Black once, and I was like, this is cool. Like I had no idea that this was ever going to happen. There were other moments like that, but for the most part, I just felt like part of the scene.
And, you've done some hopping around. Obviously going from Southern California to New York is a big thing. And then you go to a community like Portland, and that's one of the very few places out west I haven't been to, but I always hear that, the jazz radio scene's really good up there. The jazz scene has a good vibe. Was it relieving to get back on the West Coast and get into a scene like that? Mostly
at first, no. I sort of left New York reluctantly. That's not exactly fair. I mean, I mostly the biggest reason I left New York was to kind of move along with like family life and stuff like that, and I didn't feel like I was going to be successful enough at that in New York to be able to like maintain a family at the level I wanted to. But I knew I was going to miss the scene and miss the city. It took me a long time to kind of admit that I wasn't a New Yorker anymore, so that was my first reaction leaving New York. But Portland is an awesome place. I mean, I'm so happy I live here. There is a great scene in terms of musicians. I didn't really know anything about Portland when I moved here, and I knew exactly one person on the music scene. And, that's changed in the 5+ years I've lived here, and I was so pleasantly surprised with the depth of the talent pool here in Portland. It was kind of like weird for me. I was like, I had no idea that this many killing people were in this town. The level of musicianship here is a lot higher than I expected. New Yorkers, of which I felt one, they tend to like not pay attention to anything that's happening outside of New York. And also they tend to think that everything in New York is the best thing ever. And, I can admit that. So I sort of had like a low set of expectations for anywhere. It wasn't just Portland, just like anywhere, I'm going to move somewhere and like, I'm not going to be challenged that much. And I'm so glad I was wrong. Like, I'm so glad that I was dumb. Because there are so many great musicians here, and they're nice. There are different styles of music to play here too, which is a big thing for me. I'm glad that my New Yorker self was flat wrong.
Well, you know, my dad grew up in Long Island, was born in Brooklyn. I have New York roots. I love New Yorkers. I still have family up there. But I got to tell you, what you just said there epitomizes an experience that I had the other night watching a Mets game. It was like the eighth inning. They got a 12-3 record. They're doing great. And I think the Mets pitcher walked home one of the batters against Washington, and the crowd's booing. Okay? So I'm from Kansas City, and, you know, we don't play around. We only booed when we were going through like 25 years of darkness, you know?
Right.
These guys have always been competitive, even since 2015, and historically, and I'm thinking, how could you even think to boo in the eighth inning, and it's tied, and they're one run ahead? It was just like, it's that mentality, and I'm not trying to bag on New York at all. I'm just saying, even the Yankees do it. It's like there's this high level of expectation, and the only thing that myopically is in their, right in front of their eyes is just that team. Not the fact they're in first place. It was really weird. I was blown away, you know.
Yeah.
But I guess.
Joe, I'll share that with you. I'm a huge baseball fan myself, and like the New York baseball fandom is kind of like central to what we're talking about here, and I totally agree. I'm sure the phrase, like, what have you done for me lately, was invented in New York. You know what I mean?
Well, you know, the one thing that I've always been very cognizant of when I talk to musicians that come from either of the coasts is that there's something about coming to a Midwestern city that's relieving to a certain degree, because it is pretty hardcore. There, you know, things move fast. People can be abrasive. There's a high level of expectation. Not that there's a low in the Midwest, but there's a different vibe. There's a different flow of life. So, I just could never imagine any fans in Kansas City booing if we were 12-3 and let up one run in the eighth of a game that we were tied. It just it blows my mind. I mean, I've been at games where we've just been totally schlackled and there's not one person booing. It's just, I don't know if we're cognizant of karma, or I don't know. It's just, there's something that goes into it. It's very interesting. But I've always known that about New York, especially, is that there's always kind of this short-term memory with baseball sometimes. It's like they just want them to win constantly. It's kind of the way it flows. But anyway, I want to get to the crux of, you know, you're a performer, you release albums, but you're also an educator, and it seems to be more of a overlying theme with musicians, that you're not just out there doing your thing, you're also teaching. How integral is teaching to who you are as a musician organism?
It's huge. I'm really glad that I discovered teaching. I you know, when I was at San Diego State and moving to New York, I wasn't thinking about one day becoming a jazz educator. It happened to me later, kind of as I discussed before, and I'm really happy with it. Like, I kind of started the idea of, I got behind the idea of teaching and jazz education out of a sense of duty, like to keep the tradition going and like try to share my experiences, which were different than I was taught, you know, in education, that kind of thing. And I'm so happy that it's actually become something that is more like personally fulfilling than something out of a sense of duty. Like, I enjoy it. And I learn a lot along the way too. And it also sometimes, as in a lesson yesterday, kind of reminds me that I need to get back and practice a lot more too. So, I'm really happy that education is part of the package that I try to present as an artist as well. And I think it's also helped me kind of hone the branding of my music, that it needs to connect with people, and not be off in its own little sphere. The things I'm doing, I'm trying to connect, and that's what we try to do as teachers, is connect with students.
What kind of shows, since New York's on my mind here, and we've been talking about it so much, what live shows did you see in New York that really moved you, that stuck with you?
I try to see Paul Motion as often as I could. He's a musical hero of mine for sure. So he was always at the vanguard, you know, with his trio of Bill Frisell and Joe Lovano, or the Electric Bebop Band, or the Trio 2000 plus however many members, I try to see Paul Motian as often as possible for sure. I also like to go into the 55 bar a lot for the various regulars that they had there. Wayne Krantz, I believe that was on Thursday nights, probably still is. Dave Vinny was a regular. And then also just like my friends from Brooklyn would often play there. The Village Vanguard were two places I went frequently for sure. There are so many great places to go in New York. I mean, it's hard to just kind of pick a few, but those are the two that probably stick out the most.
So let me ask you this. Why do you love jazz?
As far as a vehicle for expression, it resonates with me more than others. I am not the kind of person that can do the same thing over and over and over. In fact, I just got back from a tour with the Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble, and we played the same book of music more than once a day, for several days in a row. And it was challenging for me to play the same exact music the same way over and over and over. I had to find new ways to make it through that. That's what I like about jazz, is that you can do the same thing differently day in, day out. In fact, if you do the same thing twice, you're kind of doing it wrong, I feel like. Or at least that's the way I approach it. I'm not going to say that that's how it should be. But when I hear Monk on recordings play the same song, it's never really the same way twice. So that's what I love about jazz, is that repetition is maybe valued, but not as much as innovation or reinvention.
Let me ask you this. Let me get the essence of you. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, those that buy your music, your students. But who do you think you are?
Who do I think I am? How I like to think about myself. Honesty is really important. I'm really, I put a lot of stock in being honest. And sometimes, I guess you could be honest to a fault. Sometimes being too honest is a thing. And I probably err on that side of things more than politeness sometimes. But I think I'm an honest person. I'm definitely a loyal person, and I think that's evidenced by my sports fandom. Been a Golden State Warriors fan since I was 12 years old, and it's finally paying off. But it was pretty rough there for about 15 years. So I definitely am a loyal person. I'm pretty dedicated. I definitely don't give up easy, if at all. And that has benefits, but it also has some unintended side effects as well. Those are some things that definitely I think some values that I gravitate towards, or try to make the best I can.
Well, Ryan, I think that wraps everything up. Thanks for opening up about Lost Days, about your career in music. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Portland, San Jose, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Ryan for his music and his time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.